What you're about to see changed everything I thought I knew about missing persons cases. 3 college students, 1 videotape, 17 years of silence. In 1990, 3 university students drove into Death Valley for spring break and simply vanished. No bodies, no witnesses, no explanation. But in 2007, a construction worker found something that made this case infinitely more disturbing. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button, because this story gets darker with every detail, and you won't want to miss what happens next. I've been investigating cold cases for over 2 decades, but nothing prepared me for what I discovered about Marcus Chen, Sarah Williams, and Jake Morrison. 3 UCLA students who disappeared without a trace during what should have been an ordinary spring break trip. The case file sits on my desk even now, filled with photographs that still give me chills and witness statements that contradict everything we thought we knew about their final days. When I first opened this file in 1990, I was a young detective convinced that missing persons cases in Death Valley were straightforward. People got lost, ran out of water, and succumbed to the merciless desert heat. I was wrong about everything. It was March 15th, 1990, when they loaded Marcus's red Toyota pickup truck with camping gear and enough supplies for a week-long adventure in Death Valley. Sarah, a psychology major with an infectious laugh, had convinced her 2 best friends to join her for what she called the ultimate desert experience. Marcus, studying engineering, was the practical one who mapped out their route and checked weather conditions obsessively. Jake, the film student, brought along his new video camera, determined to document what he hoped would become an epic road trip memory. None of them could have imagined that this camera would become the only witness to their final hours alive. The 3 had been inseparable since freshman year, known around campus as the Trio because they did everything together. Their professors described them as responsible students who never missed classes without good reason. Sarah's roommate, Jennifer Martinez, told police that Sarah had been planning this trip for months, researching the best camping spots and even purchasing a new sleeping bag specifically for the desert climate. She was meticulous about details, the type of person who would never just disappear without telling someone where she was going. Jennifer showed us Sarah's detailed itinerary written in her careful handwriting, with backup plans and emergency procedures that demonstrated just how seriously she took their safety. According to Jennifer's statement, Sarah had called her parents the night before departure, confirming their itinerary and promising to check in every other day. The plan was simple. Drive to Death Valley, set up camp near Zabriskie Point, spend 3 days hiking and exploring, then return to UCLA by March 21st. Marcus had even submitted a detailed trip plan to the campus safety office, complete with GPS coordinates and emergency contact numbers. Everything about their departure suggested 3 young people excited about a normal spring break adventure. Sarah's mother, Eleanor Williams, later told me that her daughter had seemed more excited about this trip than anything else in her college career. The last confirmed sighting of the 3 students was at a gas station in Baker, California, approximately 90 miles from their intended campsite. The attendant, Robert Mills, remembered them clearly because Jake was filming everything with his video camera, even documenting the process of filling up the tank. Mills described them as happy kids having fun, noting that Sarah bought postcards while Marcus studied a roadmap with intense concentration. Jake had joked with Mills about becoming a famous filmmaker someday, and Mills remembered thinking they seemed like typical college students enjoying their freedom. The timestamp on the receipt showed 2:47 p.m. on March 16, 1990. This seemingly innocent transaction would become the last confirmed proof that they were alive. From that gas station, they would have needed roughly 2 hours to reach their planned camping area near Zabriskie Point. The desert roads were clear that day, weather conditions optimal for driving with temperatures in the comfortable mid-70s. Park rangers later confirmed that their truck was never spotted at any of the official campgrounds or visitor centers. It was as if they had driven into the vast emptiness of Death Valley and simply ceased to exist. The 91-mile stretch of highway between Baker and their intended destination became the focus of intense scrutiny. But despite searching every mile marker and examining every possible turnoff, investigators found no trace of where they might have left the main road. When the students failed to return to UCLA by March 22nd, Sarah's parents contacted campus security immediately. They knew their daughter well enough to understand that she would never miss her Monday morning psychology seminar without calling first. By March 24th, a full-scale search operation was underway, coordinated by the National Park Service and involving multiple law enforcement agencies. The search area covered over 800 square miles of some of the most challenging terrain in North America. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras swept vast sections of desert, while ground teams with search dogs combed through canyon systems and rocky outcroppings where a vehicle might have gone undetected. The initial search lasted 3 weeks and involved over 200 personnel working in rotating shifts around the clock. They found absolutely nothing. No tire tracks in the sand, no abandoned vehicle hidden behind rock formations, no camping equipment scattered by desert winds, no trace that 3 young people had ever been in that unforgiving landscape. The desert seemed to have swallowed them completely, leaving behind not even the smallest clue about their fate. Veteran search and rescue coordinator Tom Bradley later told me it was the most baffling case he had encountered in 30 years of desert operations. The investigation consumed months of my early career as a detective. I interviewed their families, their friends, their professors, anyone who might have known about their plans or their state of mind in the weeks leading up to their departure. Sarah's mother showed me her daughter's journal, filled with excited entries about the upcoming trip and detailed packing lists that included everything from extra batteries for Jake's camera to a small first aid kit. Marcus's father provided copies of credit card statements showing purchases of camping gear and trail mix in the weeks leading up to their departure, proving that this was a carefully planned adventure, not an impulsive decision. Jake's girlfriend, Amanda Foster, gave us rolls of film he had shot in the days before leaving, all showing normal college life activities, study sessions in the library, basketball games on campus, casual dinners at their favorite restaurant. Amanda described Jake as being more excited about testing his new video camera than about the actual camping trip. He had saved money for months to buy the expensive equipment and was eager to create what he called his desert documentary. The last conversation Amanda had with Jake was on March 14th, when he called to say goodbye and promised to show her the footage when he returned. Every lead led nowhere. Some theorized they had gotten lost and died of exposure, their bodies eventually claimed by the desert scavengers and relentless sandstorms. Others suggested they had encountered dangerous individuals and become victims of foul play, though there was no evidence of criminal activity in the area during that time period. A few family members clung to hope that they had somehow survived and chosen to disappear voluntarily, perhaps running away from academic pressure or family expectations, though this theory made no sense given their close relationships and their excitement about returning to finish the semester. The case officially went cold in 1992 after 2 years of intensive investigation had yielded no substantial leads. The families never stopped searching, organizing annual search parties that brought together volunteers from across California. They maintained a website with photographs and last known whereabouts, updating it regularly with new theories and potential leads. Private investigators were hired and dismissed when they failed to produce results. Psychics offered their services, claiming to have visions of the student's location, but none of their predictions led to any discoveries. Amateur sleuths proposed increasingly elaborate theories on internet forums, ranging from alien abduction to government conspiracy. But serious investigators had long since moved on to cases with more promising evidence. I had personally given up hope of ever finding answers when, on October 3, 2007, my phone rang at 6:30 in the morning. The caller was David Rodriguez, a construction worker employed by Desert Demolition Company. David was calling from a demolition site in Barstow, California, about 60 miles northeast of where the students had last been seen. The company he worked for had been hired to tear down an abandoned roadside motel that had been closed since the mid-1990s. While breaking through what appeared to be a false wall in room 127, David had made a discovery that would reignite the investigation and answer some questions while raising infinitely more disturbing ones. Hidden behind that wall, carefully wrapped in multiple layers of plastic and sealed with duct tape, was a single VHS videotape. The label, written in faded black marker in what appeared to be Jake Morrison's handwriting, read, "Spring Break 1990, Death Valley Trip, Jake, Sarah, Marcus." David, who had grown up in the area and remembered hearing about the missing students case on local news years earlier, immediately stopped work and contacted the Barstow Police Department. Within hours, I was driving toward Barstow with an evidence team and a growing sense of dread about what that tape might contain. The motel where the tape was found was called the Desert Rose Inn, and it sat on a desolate stretch of Highway 247, the kind of place that attracted transient travelers and people who preferred to remain anonymous. The building had that distinctive 1960s roadside architecture, with individual room units arranged in an L shape around a cracked concrete courtyard, where a swimming pool had been filled with sand years earlier. According to property records, it had been owned by a man named William Ashford, who had died in 1996 under circumstances that local police described as natural but suspicious. Ashford had been found dead in his office behind the motel's reception area, apparently of a heart attack, though neighbors reported he had seemed healthy and active just days before his death. Local police had no record of Ashford ever being connected to the missing students case, and his name had never appeared in any of the original investigation files. The building had sat empty for over a decade, slowly deteriorating under the desert sun and becoming a gathering place for transients and vandals. The current owners, a development company from Las Vegas, had purchased the property with plans to demolish it and build a modern gas station and convenience store. If not for their renovation plans, that videotape might have remained hidden forever behind that false wall. The wall where David found the tape had been constructed professionally, with drywall and paint that matched the rest of the room perfectly. It wasn't a hastily concealed hiding place, but rather a carefully planned concealment that had been designed to remain undiscovered for years. The tape itself was in remarkably good condition, protected by its plastic wrapping from the moisture and temperature fluctuations that had damaged much of the motel's interior. When we examined the room more carefully, we found evidence that it had been used more recently than the motel's 1995 closure date, including fresh water stains and cigarette burns that couldn't have been more than a few years old. When we finally gathered the courage to watch the tape 3 days later in a secure evidence room, what we saw changed everything we thought we knew about those final days. The video began normally enough, with Jake's characteristic enthusiasm as he narrated their departure from UCLA. We watched Sarah's excitement as she packed her new backpack and Marcus's methodical checking of their supplies, his engineering student precision evident in how he organized their camping equipment. The early footage showed them driving through Los Angeles traffic, stopping for lunch at a McDonald's in Palmdale, and eventually reaching that gas station in Baker, where they had last been seen alive. But then the video continued beyond that final confirmed sighting, and this is where everything we thought we knew about their case fell apart. We watched as they drove deeper into Death Valley, past the point where any official search had focused, past the turnoff that would have taken them to Zabriskie Point. Jake kept filming as the landscape became increasingly desolate, documenting mile markers and road signs that would prove crucial to understanding their actual route. At mile marker 47, they turned onto an unmarked dirt road that didn't appear on any of the maps we had used during the original search. The footage showed them following this road for what appeared to be several miles, with Jake commenting on the increasingly rough terrain and Sarah expressing some concern about whether their truck could handle the rocky path. Marcus, visible in the passenger seat, was consulting what looked like handwritten directions on a piece of paper, not the official park maps they had shown their families. About 15 minutes into their journey on this unmarked road, they encountered a chain-link gate with signs warning against trespassing. Instead of turning back, they stopped and waited as if they had been expecting this obstacle. The final minutes of the tape were the most disturbing part of this entire investigation. The camera showed them arriving at what looked like a small compound of prefabricated buildings hidden among large rock formations that would have made it invisible from any aerial search. Sarah's voice could be heard asking, "Are you sure this is the right place?" While Marcus expressed growing concern about the isolated location and the fact that there were no other vehicles visible. Jake continued filming as they approached what appeared to be a group of 4 or 5 people waiting for them near the largest building, though the distance and lighting made it impossible to make out faces clearly. The last clear image showed a middle-aged man approaching their truck, reaching toward Jake's camera window and speaking words that were inaudible over the sound of the wind. Jake's camera continued recording for another 30 seconds, but the lens had apparently been covered because the screen showed only darkness, while audio picked up muffled voices and what sounded like Jake protesting about something. Then there was a sharp cracking sound, possibly the camera being damaged, and the recording ended abruptly in the middle of what might have been Sarah screaming. What happened to Marcus Chen, Sarah Williams, and Jake Morrison in those hidden desert buildings? How did their final video end up sealed behind a wall in an abandoned motel 60 miles from where they disappeared? Who were the people they met at that compound? And why had they been directed there instead of their planned campsite at Zabriskie Point? The tape raised infinitely more questions than it answered, suggesting that their disappearance wasn't a simple case of getting lost in the desert, but something far more sinister and carefully orchestrated. The investigation was reopened immediately with a focus on identifying the location shown in the video and tracking down anyone who might have been connected to that remote compound. Using the mile markers and landscape features visible in Jake's footage, we were eventually able to locate the area where they had been taken. However, 17 years had passed since their disappearance, and the compound had been abandoned for what appeared to be at least a decade. The buildings had been stripped of anything valuable and showed signs of vandalism and weather damage that made any forensic investigation nearly impossible. William Ashford, the motel owner who had apparently hidden the tape, had taken his secrets to the grave when he died in 1996. His personal effects had been disposed of by distant relatives who had no knowledge of his connection to the missing student's case. Neighbors described him as a quiet man who kept to himself and rarely spoke about his past, though some remembered he had mentioned working in Death Valley during the 1980s as a guide for tourists interested in exploring remote areas of the desert. The case remains officially unsolved, but that videotape proved one thing conclusively. Whatever happened to those 3 students was intentional, planned, and covered up by people who wanted them to disappear forever. Someone had lured them away from their intended destination using false directions, led them to a remote location where they were vulnerable and isolated, and then made sure their fate would never be discovered. The fact that their final recording was hidden so carefully suggests that whoever was responsible wanted to preserve evidence of what happened, perhaps as a trophy or insurance against future complications. But the videotape was only the beginning of what we would uncover in the months that followed. Armed with the exact location coordinates derived from Jake's footage, I returned to that remote compound with a forensic team in November 2007. What we found there would add layers of horror to an already disturbing case. The compound consisted of 5 buildings arranged in a rough circle around a central courtyard area. The largest structure appeared to have been some kind of workshop or garage, with concrete floors stained dark with substances that field tests suggested might be blood, though 17 years of desert weathering made definitive analysis impossible. In the smallest building, what looked like it had once been living quarters, we made a discovery that sent chills through the entire investigation team. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard was a metal box containing dozens of photographs, not of Marcus, Sarah, and Jake, but of other young people, all appearing to be college-aged, all photographed in what appeared to be states of distress or fear. The photographs were dated sporadically throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, suggesting that whatever had happened to our 3 students was part of a much larger pattern of predatory behavior. Each photograph had a number written on the back in the same handwriting that had appeared on Jake's videotape label. The numbers seemed to correspond to a filing system, though we never found the files themselves. Some photos showed young people bound with rope. Others showed them in various stages of undress, and the most disturbing ones showed what appeared to be torture or ritualistic abuse. The expressions on their faces haunted my dreams for months afterward. We submitted the photographs to the FBI's database of missing persons, and over the following year, we were able to identify 11 of the individuals pictured. All had been reported missing between 1986 and 1991. All were college students, and all had last been seen heading to remote areas for camping or hiking trips. The pattern was becoming clear, but it was more extensive and more horrifying than we had initially imagined. Someone, or more likely a group of people, had been systematically targeting college students for years, luring them to this remote location using false pretenses and then subjecting them to prolonged torture before presumably killing them. The videotape of Marcus, Sarah, and Jake's final moments suggested they had been the latest victims in what appeared to be a serial killing operation that had been operating in the desert for at least 5 years. Our investigation into William Ashford's background revealed connections that made the case even more disturbing. Property records showed that Ashford had purchased the Desert Rose Inn in 1987, just 1 year after the first of the identified victims had disappeared. Bank records, which took months to obtain through court orders, showed regular cash deposits to Ashford's account during the late 1980s and early 1990s, always in amounts just under $10,000 to avoid federal reporting requirements. The deposits stopped abruptly in March 1990, just weeks after Marcus, Sarah, and Jake disappeared. More troubling was what we discovered about Ashford's previous employment. Before purchasing the motel, he had worked as a maintenance supervisor for the National Park Service, with access to remote areas of Death Valley that most tourists never saw. His employment records showed he had been fired in 1986 for what his supervisor described as inappropriate interest in young visitors and failure to report safety concerns. The supervisor, who had since retired, told us that Ashford had been caught multiple times giving unauthorized tours to college-aged visitors, often directing them away from established trails toward more isolated areas. Former co-workers described Ashford as a loner who seemed to take particular pleasure in frightening visitors with stories about people who had disappeared in the desert. He had an extensive knowledge of Death Valley's most remote locations and often boasted about knowing places where someone could disappear forever and never be found. One former colleague remembered Ashford mentioning that he maintained a private research station in the desert where he studied survival behavior under extreme stress, though no official records of such a facility existed. The most chilling discovery came when we examined Ashford's personal belongings, which had been stored in a self-storage unit in Barstow since his death in 1996. Among his possessions was a detailed journal spanning from 1986 to 1990, written in a code that took federal cryptographers 3 months to decipher. The journal entries described what Ashford called experiments in human endurance and psychological breaking points, He wrote about recruiting college students for what he told them were paid research studies about survival in extreme environments. According to the journal, Ashford had developed an elaborate system for identifying and targeting potential victims. He would monitor college campuses, looking for students who were planning desert camping trips. Using his knowledge of Park Service procedures and his access to official-looking documentation, he would contact these students and offer them opportunities to participate in what he claimed were legitimate research studies. The journal described how he would provide false maps and directions that would lead victims to his compound instead of their intended destinations. The entries about Marcus, Sarah, and Jake were particularly detailed and disturbing. Ashford had apparently been monitoring their trip planning for weeks through contacts he had developed at UCLA. He had even arranged for someone to approach them on campus, pretending to be a graduate student conducting research on desert survival, and had convinced them to accept modified directions that would lead them to his compound. The journal described his excitement about having 3 subjects instead of his usual single victims, and his plans for what he called group dynamic experiments. But the journal entries stopped abruptly on March 18, 1990, just 2 days after Marcus, Sarah, and Jake had disappeared. The final entry was brief and uncharacteristic of Ashford's usually detailed writing style. It simply stated, "Subjects proved more resourceful than anticipated. Complications have arisen. Emergency protocols initiated. This facility must be abandoned immediately." This suggested that something had gone wrong with Ashford's plans, that perhaps the 3 students had fought back or escaped in some way that forced him to abandon his operation. This theory gained support when we discovered evidence of a fire at the compound that had occurred sometime in early 1990. Burn patterns on the concrete floors and scorch marks on the metal walls suggested that someone had deliberately set fires in multiple buildings, possibly to destroy evidence. Chemical analysis of the burn materials revealed traces of accelerants, indicating the fires had been intentionally set rather than occurring naturally. The timing of these fires, combined with Ashford's abrupt journal cessation, suggested that the March 1990 incident had been catastrophic enough to force the immediate abandonment of the entire operation. Our investigation also revealed that Ashford had not been working alone. Phone records from the Desert Rose Inn showed regular calls to a number registered to a man named Thomas Garrett, who had been employed as a security guard at various remote mining operations throughout Nevada and California during the 1980s and 1990s. When we finally tracked down Garrett in 2008, he was living in a trailer park outside of Las Vegas, suffering from what appeared to be severe alcoholism and paranoid delusions. His initial response to our questions was complete denial, but after several hours of interrogation, he broke down and provided details that corroborated much of what we had learned from Ashford's journal. According to Garrett's confession, he had met Ashford in 1985 when both men were working for the Park Service. Ashford had recruited him into what he initially believed was a legitimate research project studying human behavior under stress. Garrett claimed he didn't realize the true nature of the operation until he had already participated in the abduction and torture of several victims. By then, Ashford had made it clear that Garrett was as guilty as he was, and that any attempt to report the crimes would result in his own imprisonment or worse. Garrett described the compound as a sophisticated torture facility designed to keep victims alive for extended periods, while subjecting them to various forms of physical and psychological abuse. He claimed that Ashford was obsessed with documenting everything, creating detailed records of each victim's responses to different stimuli. The photographs we had found were apparently just a small portion of the documentation that Ashford had created. According to Garrett, there were also hours of videotapes and extensive written records that had been destroyed in the fires that ended the operation. The most significant revelation from Garrett's confession concerned what had happened to Marcus, Sarah, and Jake specifically. According to Garrett, the three students had been more resourceful and determined than previous victims. Within hours of their arrival at the compound, they had managed to partially free themselves and had attempted to escape. During the ensuing struggle, Jake had apparently managed to grab his video camera and hide the tape in his clothing before he was recaptured. The students' resistance had been fierce enough that one of them, Garrett claimed it was Marcus, had actually succeeded in seriously injuring Ashford during the escape attempt. Rather than continue with his usual procedures, Ashford had made the decision to kill all three students immediately and dispose of their bodies. Garrett described helping to bury them in unmarked graves somewhere in the desert, though he claimed he had been too traumatized by the experience to remember the exact location. This explained why no trace of their remains had ever been found, despite extensive searches. The desert had swallowed their bodies just as effectively as it had hidden the truth about their deaths for 17 years. The fires at the compound had been set by Ashford himself, according to Garrett, in an attempt to destroy all evidence of the operation before fleeing the area. Ashford had apparently planned to relocate and continue his activities elsewhere, but something had prevented him from doing so. Garrett believed that Ashford's death in 1996 had not been natural, as officially reported, but had been the result of paranoia and fear about eventually being discovered. He suggested that Ashford had either committed suicide or had been killed by someone else who knew about the desert operation. Garrett's confession led us to search for additional burial sites in the areas he described, but despite months of effort involving ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, we never found any human remains. The desert had kept its secrets too well, or Garrett's memory had been too damaged by years of alcohol abuse to provide accurate information. However, his detailed knowledge of the compound's layout and the specific methods used to torture victims convinced us that his basic story was true, even if he couldn't help us locate the final resting places of Marcus, Sarah, Jake, and the other victims. The case was officially closed in 2009, with both Ashford and Garrett dead and no possibility of prosecution. Garrett had died of liver failure just months after his confession, taking with him any remaining details about the exact locations where the victims had been buried. The families of all the identified victims were notified about what we had learned, though this knowledge brought them little comfort. Knowing how their loved ones had died was almost worse than not knowing anything at all. What haunts me most about this case is not just the horror of what happened to those young people, but the realization of how many other similar operations might still be active in remote areas across the country. Ashford and Garrett had operated for years without detection, preying on college students who were seeking adventure and freedom in the wilderness. Their system had been sophisticated and carefully planned, suggesting that they had learned from experience or had been trained by others who were equally skilled at making people disappear. The videotape that led us to the truth had been hidden by someone who wanted the evidence to survive, even if the truth took 17 years to emerge. Whether this was Ashford's own insurance policy or something hidden by one of his victims in their final moments, we'll never know for certain. But that tape ensured that Marcus Chen, Sarah Williams, and Jake Morrison would not be forgotten, and that their families would finally understand what had happened during those final terrifying hours in the desert. What do you think really happened to Marcus, Sarah, and Jake in that remote desert compound? Leave your theories in the comments below.